Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're tossing out those standard diplomatic talking points about ideology and self-determination. Instead, we're diving straight into the pure, unvarnished, realpolitik reasons why Taiwan is absolutely the #1 strategic proxy node for Western global hegemony. We're going to look at the raw mechanics of global power and figure out why this single spot matters more than almost any other piece of real estate on the planet.
So, to kick things off, I want to pose a question that kind of flips our usual perspective. It's really easy to just look at Taiwan as this vulnerable little island stuck between two superpowers. But what if we look at it as the totally indispensable anchor of our modern industrial survival? Seriously, how does a piece of land roughly the size of Maryland hold the entire global tech stack and the international economy right in the palm of its hand?
Well, here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 5 key areas. First, the geographic linchpin. Second, the semiconductor monopoly. Third, the fragile fortress. Fourth, asymmetric tactics. And finally, number 5, systemic collapse.
Okay, starting right off with Section 1, the geographic linchpin, also known as the first island chain. Let's set up the physical stakes here by looking at the global chessboard.
You know the saying, geography is destiny? Well, Taiwan sits dead center in this highly intentional containment grid that Western strategists call the first island chain. Picture this chain as a massive, unsinkable radar and missile system that stretches all the way from Japan down through the Philippines. Because it's firmly anchored in the Western alignment, Taiwan actively blocks the Chinese Navy from just sailing out into the deep, unmonitored waters of the open Pacific. It's literally the keystone holding that entire arch together.
And this perfectly illustrates the crazy geopolitical reality of that map. If that chain stays intact, Western maritime dominance is totally secure. But if that chain breaks, if Taiwan falls, hostile nuclear subs and carrier strike groups suddenly get a free pass into the deep ocean trenches. And boom, overnight they can directly threaten Hawaii and the west coast of North America. Losing just this one geographic node would instantly make all those neighboring proxy defenses completely useless. It would shatter Western maritime dominance in Asia, just like that.
Moving right along to Section 2, the semiconductor monopoly, or what's often called the silicon shield. Let's zoom all the way in to see how this crucial geography gets compounded by an absolute, unmatched structural monopoly.
Now take a look at the sheer, unprecedented scale of this chokehold. We are talking about the global production of sub-7-nanometer microchips. One single Taiwanese corporation, TSMC, makes over 90% of them. Over 90! The entire rest of the planet combined is scraping by on less than 10%. And these aren't just everyday chips. These are the highly specialized, virtually non-reproducible brains that run everything from AI models and massive cloud data centers to your advanced smartphones and yeah, even automated guidance systems for precision military missiles.
So the real kicker is exactly what this quote gets at. Because there is absolutely no immediate domestic backup. No alternative factory grid sitting around in the West that can just spin up and replace this output. Washington is forced to treat Taiwan's defense not as some kind of foreign policy favor, but as a mandatory requirement for its own domestic survival. If a hostile power took over or sabotaged those boundaries, Western industrial production would literally freeze. Taiwan holds an absolute structural veto over the modern world. No joke. Which brings us to a really fascinating high-stakes paradox in Section 3, the fragile fortress and its massive resource vulnerability.
So we just established their totally unrivaled technological supremacy, right? They run the most hyper-advanced electronic industrial infrastructure on the face of the Earth. But when you strip away the tech and look at the physical reality of the island itself, well, it tells a wildly different story about self-sufficiency.
Because to keep that hyper-advanced economy humming, Taiwan needs massive inputs. And that brings us to this absolutely staggering number, 97%. Taiwan has to import roughly 97 to 98% of its entire energy supply. We're talking liquefied natural gas, crude oil, coal, the whole shebang. They have almost zero domestic natural resources to fuel their own technological marvels. When you lay out these structural vulnerabilities side by side, the true fragility of this fortress becomes glaringly obvious. Their energy infrastructure is super centralized. They lack deep strategic reserves. Heck, even their domestic farming can't sustain their dense population for very long. So, in a high-intensity conflict, a hostile naval blockade could choke off these imports in a matter of weeks. That would trigger a systemic power grid failure, paralyze civilian life, and instantly shut down the automated factories that the rest of the world desperately relies on. So physical self-sufficiency for Taiwan? It's literally a logistical impossibility without a heavily protected Western maritime corridor.
So how on earth do they survive? Let's transition to Section 4, asymmetric tactics and their native defense complex, to see exactly how Taiwan compensates for having zero raw materials by leaning on its specialized industrial core.
Knowing they're geographically isolated, Taiwan has spent decades engineering what military folks call asymmetric denial tactics. Basically, instead of trying to match a superpower tank for tank or ship for ship, they've pivoted their domestic manufacturing to pump out low-cost, high-impact defensive tools. They build things like the Huxiong-3 supersonic missiles natively, hiding them on mobile camouflage launchers up in the mountains. They mass-produce advanced sea mines and these crazy commercial-grade military drone swarms. By outsourcing the frontline fighting to autonomous systems and robotics, they've created a lethal deterrent against enemy surface fleets, and they do it without needing a massive standing army.
And just look at the incredible leverage this creates on the global board. From a Western perspective, Taiwan acts as this permanent, high-velocity distraction. It absorbs Beijing's strategic energy and literally trillions of dollars, forcing the superpower to exhaust its military apparatus on solving the tactical puzzle of a cross-strait invasion, instead of, say, projecting power into Europe or Africa. For the US, it's the ultimate cost-effective shield. It checks expansionist ambitions at a massive strategic discount and totally avoids the need to park huge American ground armies on the Asian mainland.
For our final section, Section 5, Systemic Collapse and the Domino Effect, let's zoom all the way back out to the global level to understand just how catastrophic a potential conflict would actually be.
Let's map out how this domino effect actually builds, because a flashpoint here wouldn't just be a localized problem. It would trigger a total vertical collapse of the international macroeconomic structure. Step 1. The foundries are taken offline, whether by strikes, cyber sabotage, or a blockade. Instantly, assembly lines for consumer tech, cars, and military hardware all over the world just freeze. Step 2. That downstream industrial halt completely shatters global shipping logistics. And that brings us straight to Step 3, a devastating, inevitable crash of international financial markets. To really grasp Step 2 of that domino effect, you just have to look at this one fact. Over half of the entire global container ship fleet transits right through the narrow waters of the Taiwan Strait every single year. Over half. If a conflict turns this vital commercial corridor into an active combat zone, these massive container ships would have to reroute all the way around the southern tip of Australia. That adds weeks to transit times, causes worldwide container shortages, and would trigger hyperinflationary shocks for basic goods and medical supplies that would absolutely dwarf any economic crisis we've seen in modern history.
The financial toll of a scenario like this is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Independent macroeconomic assessments estimate that a blockade would inflict a staggering drag of over $10 trillion on the global economy. To put that into perspective, that's roughly 10% of the entire global GDP wiped out, almost overnight. Stock exchanges would see historic crashes as tech giants and logistics monopolies just watch their valuations evaporate. Traditional economic forecasting, totally out the window. Central banks wouldn't even be able to manage the inflation with standard interest rate hikes. The entire global system just grinds to a halt.
And that brings us to the absolute genius of Taiwan's strategic architecture, the inverted security guarantee. In classical geopolitics, a proxy nation usually has to prove its worth to a superpower to earn protection. Well, Taiwan completely flipped that script. By concentrating the world's most vital technological nervous system entirely within its own sovereign borders, Taiwan doesn't need a massive army to conquer its neighbors. It essentially holds the digital economy of the West hostage simply by existing. They achieve ultimate physical security through mutually assured economic destruction.
So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. We started out by looking at a map and a small, seemingly vulnerable island. But when you realize that their localized destruction guarantees a global systemic collapse, the power dynamics completely flip upside down. In a world where physical security is dictated entirely by extreme economic interdependency, who really controls the global chessboard? Does the superpower protect the proxy, or does the proxy silently command the superpower? It's a fascinating reality that completely rewrites the modern rules of global power. Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.